Welcome back to another Pirkei Avot text explication video with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. We are now on the 8th text in the 5th chapter, and just like we had seen in the 7th text, the operational number is number 7. That's the number that we're dealing with. The first 6 texts, you may remember, all had the number 10. So we did 6 texts, number 10. We're now onto our second text with number 7. And just a heads up, we're going to be moving on to number 4 after this text. Okay. So this is an interesting text, and we'll get to some framing around it. Shiva mine furaniot vayin laolam al shiva gufei avera. There are 7 kinds of punishments that come to the world for 7 categories of transgression. So there seem to be sort of 7 for 7, that 7 bad things happen in the world, but they don't come randomly, they don't come willy-nilly, they come for specific transgressions. So now here we are. We're going to hear about them. Okay. I'm just going to read them in English. Okay. When some people give tithes and others do not give tithes, that's the transgression. A famine from drought comes. Okay. And some go hungry and others are satisfied. Okay. So a famine from drought. Okay. That's for not tithing. Now, tithing is giving a tenth of one's produce from one's land, and there are certain system set up of how exactly one goes about tithing or tenthing, as it were. So you're supposed to give some from your land, but now people aren't getting the full produce, the full yield of one's land. Okay, number 2. When everybody has decided not to give tithes, a famine from tumult and drought comes. So it's much worse if everybody decides not to give tithing. So that's number 2. When they have in addition decided not to set apart the dough offering, that is challah, they're not giving the challah offering, then an all-consuming famine comes. So we sort of see 3 different levels of not giving a portion of one's yield, one's produce from their land, and then 3 different types of famine hit the land. So there seems to be this one-to-one relationship between how much one gives from one's land and how much one's able to get a yield from that. Okay, so those are the first 3. Okay, now we move on. Pestilence comes to the world for sins punishable by death according to the Torah, but which have not been referred to the court, and for neglect of the law regarding the fruits of the sabbatical year, that is Shemitah, or Val Perot Shvi'it, the fruits of the 7th year. Okay, so pestilence, this dever, which might be a familiar term, we encounter. It's one of the 10 plagues in the Passover Seder. So pestilence comes to the world for a sin punishable by death according to the Torah, but which have not been referred to the court, and for, so we get sort of 2 things, and for neglect of the law regarding the fruits of the sabbatical year. Now, it's interesting because the fruits of the sabbatical year, we can understand that pestilence would come because that's another agricultural aspect, but this sins punishable by death according to the Torah, but not referred to the court, is interesting because that has nothing to do with agriculture. It does, however, seem like a grave miscarriage of justice. Someone is doing something that they are very much not supposed to be doing. It's a sin punishable by death according to the Torah, and it's not even being brought to court. Severe misjustice. Okay. So that is 4 so far. Now we're on to number 5. The sword. The sword comes to the world for the delay of judgment. Now we're seeing another judgment thing. For the delay of judgment and for the perversion of judgment. In Hebrew it is va'al inoy din, va'al ivut hadin. Okay? And because of those who teach the Torah not in accordance with halacha, with not an appropriate, not the way it's supposed to be done. Okay, so the sword comes, and presumably sword is, it's interesting. The first thing I thought about is from externally. There's war, people are coming externally, but it could also be internal strife, that people come to bring out swords and violence erupts. So it could be delay of judgment and the perversion of judgment. Sure, it could be coming from the outside, but it almost seems like if judgment and justice are not being properly taken care of, if there's widespread injustice, then there could be eruption of physical and deathly violence that can erupt from within a society. And then, interestingly, because of those who teach the Torah not in accordance with halacha. V'hamorim b'Torah shelo k'halacha. That there's and this kind of fits because, again, things are not being done accordingly. Now, this is a little bit out of place, seemingly, versus those first two about the Inui Din and Ivut Hadin, both of which have to do with justice not being properly done. And here now we're talking about people who are advising with Jewish practice, right? They're talking about matters of Jewish practice, but in ways that are not normally done, or perhaps even against the way that things should be done. So things are out of balance, and when things go out of balance, then it's a bit of extreme, but then ultimately there could be violence that would erupt. Two more. Wild beasts come to the world for swearing in vain. Wow. And for the profanation of the name. Chaya ra bal la'olam al shavuot shav al chilu Hashem. So it comes for swearing in vain. Now, swearing in vain, what we're really talking about is you say, I swear on such and such. I promise you that such and such happened, and I swear to God, okay? Take my word that I'm promising you, God is my seal. You can trust it. But if you're lying, that's terrible. And that's similar with profanation of the name, Chil Hashem, which is a desecration of the name, desecration of God's name, that it really makes God look bad. And that's a similar thing with a Shavuot Shav, with an empty or vain oath that you take this oath, or you say this oath, and it's why even bother? It's making God look empty and making God look useless, and that's really, really bad. And then finally, the seventh one. Now, it's interesting also. We have 6, now we're about to get to a 7th punishment, which is interesting. But we also had that there were 7, interesting, Gufei Avera. So these are not actually 7 transgressions themselves, because we've already seen more than 7. We're not even at the 7th punishment yet. However, what we do see is that they are Gufei Avera, that they are categories of transgression. So now we are going to come to the final one, which is Galut. Galut Baal La'olam, that exile from one's land, comes to the world, all Ovdei Avodah Zarah, Va'al Gilui Arayot, Va'al Shvichut Damin, Va'al Hashmatat Ha'aretz. 4 things. But what's fascinating is these first three categories are what are typically referred to in rabbinic literature as sort of the cardinal sins. This trio of really significant sins of Ovdei Avodah Zarah are those who are actively worshiping idols. Number 2, Gilui Arayot are sexual transgressions. Sexual transgressions. And then finally, Shvichut Damim, which is murder, bloodshed. Now, so those are the first 3. But what's interesting is we get a 4th one here, which is not typically included in sort of that grouping, which is Hashmatat Ha'aretz, which is Shemitah, which is releasing the land, that the 7th year. So the cycle is normally, the agricultural cycle is that there are 6 years that we are enabled to work the land, but that 7th year is a Shemitah, which is basically it's a Shabbat. It's a Sabbath for the land. We let the land rest. We don't work it. And here it's saying we lose out on the land, right? We inappropriately use the land by working it that 7th year, and therefore we get exiled. We get taken away from the land. Now, the first 3 we get taken away from the land because those are just so utterly severe. We actually see in Leviticus, I believe, 18, that it specifically talks about the reference between the land and sexual impropriety, and then murder and idol worship. I would imagine those are also so incredibly severe. So these are not exactly 7 transgressions and 7 7 transgressions and 7 punishments. There's 7 transgressions and 7 sort of genres or categories of punishments. Now, I found this in this book, this Rabbi Yitz Greenberg in this Sage Advice book. So I found some insights on this text that we have in front of us to be really insightful. This Mishnah, or this text that we have, seeks to find a one-to-one correspondence between sins that the population in general commits and afflictions that strike the land of Israel. The goal of the punishment is to evoke repentance and to get people to stop committing the sins. This interpretation of natural calamities is based on two principles, strongly present in rabbinic traditions whose persuasiveness has weakened in modern culture. One is the principle of measure for measure. In Hebrew, we say mida keneged mida, and we see it explicitly referenced in Mishnah Sota. Mida keneged mida, which is that you do something and something happens, that there's a measure for measure. That everything that occurs in this life is providentially arranged to give people a natural consequence of their behavior, negative and positive. The other principle is that because the land of Israel is holy, the Lord, or God operating as Lord of this land, cannot abide sins committed on it. Therefore, the Lord expels people via measure for measure retaliatory measurements. Retaliatory punishments. And now he continues into a second paragraph. In later cultures, especially in modern civilization, the atmosphere has been less sympathetic to finding this correspondence in worldly life. Instead, some authorities have stressed the world to come as the moral balance to the perceived imbalance in this world. Others, from Maimonides and Gersonides on, have stressed that the divinely arranged order operates within a cosmic, providential infrastructure in which actions do have effects and, sometimes, direct outcomes, olam k'minhago noheg. Within this order, measure for measure does not represent miraculous or unnatural interference, but the outcomes that flow from decision-making, roads taken, and the interaction implicit in the natural order and process. So that's Rabbi Yitz Greenberg on this and what's going on. It's interesting when we think about what are these 7 punishments. These 7 punishments are all very land-based, very specific to the land of Israel. And we certainly saw those first 3 that all had to do with those agricultural pieces, with tithing and so forth. And we later see some other things that have to do with society, but ultimately what Rabbi Greenberg points out is that this mida keneged mida, this measure for measure, it doesn't necessarily work out exactly the way as we've thought about it. Even in the Middle Ages, he mentioned some medieval philosophers, including Maimonides and Gersonides. So we operate differently, but I mentioned what he mentioned is that when we think about the roads taken and various actions and consequences, that there's got to be a structure to this world. So even though we don't think about the world the same way as we have with this particular text in front of us, there still is a way that the sages here are trying to make meaning out of punishments and transgressions. So this was a bit long, but this was certainly an interesting text, and thank you so much for watching.